I don't think Tomb Raider as a series or a game really needs much introduction. Its protagonist Lara Croft became an absolute cultural icon almost instantly in the 90s, appearing on I believe more magazine covers than any other video game character to this day, and she seemed to perfectly fit with that sort of girl power Spice Girls movement that was gathering on at the time. But when looking back at all this, people tend to focus on Lara's cultural significance and people often forget to talk about the actual game. Was it any good, or was it just a vehicle for the main character? And if it was good, is it still worth playing today? And let's find out, as I do a retro review of Tomb Raider on the PlayStation and Saturn. So let's start at the beginning. The game was first released for the Saturn in October 1996, thanks to a 6-week exclusivity deal Sega had with the developer's core design. It was actually developed on all three systems at once, PlayStation, PC and Saturn, with the code base just adapted for each platform, but it did come out on the Saturn first thanks to that version. But the developers have said there wasn't really a lead version of the game, it wasn't designed for the Saturn import or anything, it was all three simultaneously. And it was developed after really only 14 months by British development studio Core Design, who Amiga fans I'm sure will remember from titles such as Switchblade, Rick Dangerous, Skids, and Sega fans might remember from titles such as Chuck Rock and Wolfchild, which were their babies too. But I wouldn't say there were massive names in the industry at that time, and Tomb Raider would change all that. I think largely thanks to the way it was marketed and the kind of pre-internet rumours that just couldn't be done in today's media. I mean, how many teenage boys wasted hours trying to find the naked Lara and cheat glitch, and a lot of the adverts would play up on that, hinting that you could still do it, even though it's been proven completely false. And that kind of rumour would be proven false within a day these days. It just wouldn't be possible. But for me, I think the real trick, and the way I actually played the game first, was to put the entire second level as a playable demo on a lot of magazine covers. That second level perfectly showcased the game, and it holds most of the core design elements without really giving away some of the game's best moments. But I'm getting way ahead of myself there. Let's take a step back and before I get into those sort of design elements. So taking that step back then, Tomb Raider, if you've never played or seen it, which I mean well done if you haven't, because that's quite some good going, it's a 3D action adventure played from a third-person perspective and involves a mixture of platforming, puzzles and gun combat. You control Lara Croft as she explores various environments looking for treasure. Think of a female Indiana Jones. In fact, Toby Gard, the lead designer, often says his inspiration for Lara was a cross between Indiana Jones and the comic Tank Girl. And like Indiana Jones, the series plots often involved ancient myths and legends being true, with potentially world-ending consequences if they fell into the wrong hands. And this is especially true in the first game, where the plot starts off as a fairly light-hearted adventure that sees Lara hired to find 3 pieces of an ancient Atlantis artifact, only for it to turn really dark towards the end and involves stopping the breeding of an army of monsters that want to take over the world, all set in some really gross tomb/wombs where the walls are pulsing and all fleshy, and it gets really trippy and weird later on. On the whole though, despite that sort of jarring tonal shift in the last few levels, I would say the plot does a fairly good job. It frames the action well enough and gets out of the way when it needs to. It provides an excuse to visit some varied locations, and largely makes sense if you ignore some odd parts of cutscenes that tend to be just there for, spectacular set pieces. If I'm being critical, however, I do think the game drags a bit in the second act. There's only 15 levels of the game, and the majority of them take place in the second area in Greece, and it sees you chasing and being chased by another adventurer. And this is all fine, but I felt it went on slightly too long without moving the plot forward. Because there's a big bulk of levels there, nothing happens. You're just doing level after level after level. I think if they'd broken that up, it would have helped the game flow a bit more and kept the player motivated. In terms of gameplay, like I said earlier, the game involves mainly platforming and puzzling as you explore the 3D environments, but there is a fair amount of gunplay in there to break things up as well. And I'll start with the bad first, and it's the combat, which is really terrible. It really is. You can kind of see what they were going for. Pressing a button as Lara pull out her guns and auto lock onto targets, and as soon as you see her arms move, you know you can start firing, and she'll keep aiming with them as long as physically possible for her. You can still access her full moveset, so you can jump around, flip on the ground, trying to avoid damage while jumping and flipping over, and it kind of looks cool when it works, but you can obviously no longer grab onto ledges and things like that because her hands are full. The problem is, 9 times out of 10 combat doesn't work like this. If you're using pistols or Uzi, it kind of works because you can just hold down the fire button, it'll constantly fire at the enemy. You let go of the fire button and it picks up the next enemy and you can start firing again. With the slower weapons like the shotgun, because it still expects you to do that, but because it's slow firing, you have a tendency to press the button constantly rather than hold it down, which means if there's multiple enemies, it'll track different targets and you'll get absolutely swarmed. Then the other side of combat is the camera. It cannot keep up. It's designed for exploring mainly. In the larger rooms it's not too bad. It tries to keep Lara and the enemies on screen at a time, but they're much faster than you are, so they will dart behind you. The camera can't keep up. You'll do flips, so the camera will be bouncing around all over the place, which is really bad when the game asks you to do it in tight corridors, so you end up running to a larger space just to fight enemies. And in fact, towards the end of the game I kind of give up doing combat the way I thought developers wanted me to, and just ended up standing in place, firing at them and jumping backwards to maintain a bit of space to fire at enemies, and that tended to be my solution for most of the game. So combat is not the best, unfortunately. Thankfully, combat is not really the biggest part of the game. Yes, you will kill a lot of enemies, and I mean a lot of enemies. Mainly animals, actually. There's only about 4 or 5 humans in the game. You will, however, kill enough rare species that would make even Kurt Zuma blush at this point. But the main focus of the game, and what you'll spend most of your time doing, is exploring these tombs and solving puzzles while avoiding traps. And this side of the game is where it really shines, and it seems as if it's where most of the design thought went into it. Particularly in regards to the grid system. So back in 1996, most developers were still kind of finding their feet when it came to translating old school 2D platform into 3D, and let's be honest, most failed at this. It's really hard to track where you're going to land, and your jumps and things like that when you're in 3D. Nintendo kind of got the closest with the superb Mario 64, but that had the advantages of an analog stick and specific camera buttons, and even they realised that the type of precision platforming Mario used to do just would have to be toned down for that game. And core design didn't have those advantages with the PlayStation and Saturn. They only had a D-pad. They didn't really have enough buttons for dedicated camera buttons, despite they actually had more buttons on the pad, but there's that many actions in Tomb Raider they couldn't spare them for a camera. So it became very difficult, and their solution to this was the grid system. So what this means is the levels are actually divided up into grids, and you can see this when you're playing the game. So everything is a fixed distance apart or height. It'll be 2 blocks, 3 blocks, whatever. And while this is very game-like, it does mean that after this sort of excellent tutorial in Croft manner and a bit of time to get used to it, most players will be able to look at a gap and instantly judge, yeah, that's a 3-space jump, I can make that jump, or that's a 2-space jump, that's this type of jump to get over it. So you soon start to realise what you can and can't do in this one, and it takes a lot of that difficulty that early 3D platformers had out of the equation. Combine that grid structure with a more slow and methodical control method, and you get a design that I think is perfectly suited to the kind of exploration the game excels at. You know your limits, you know for the majority of the game at least that you're going to get given the breathing space to assess what's going on and to pick your path through the game carefully. There's a few instances where it does ask you to move forward at pace, but these tend to be generally in a straight line. You're not turning a corner and having to readjust and line yourself back up again at a breakneck pace. You're usually given the time to do things. And this applies to the jump as well. You can adjust it slightly in mid-air, but once you hit that arc, you're committed to it for the most part. And this takes the camera out of the equation a lot when it comes to exploration. The slow pace means that it gets time to adjust and put it back behind you where it can. It does a great job in large environments, and there's also a button to look around, so it doesn't become much of a problem. You can use it to explore and look at your environment with a touch of a button, and then move it, pan it round a bit just to see where you're heading and get that look ahead, which all encourages a very methodical approach to your playstyle, which matches the puzzle design well. This does have a slight downside in some instances, however, as that moment most puzzle games rely on, that feeling when you finally figure out the solution and then solve it, is very delayed in Tomb Raider. Often you'll figure out the solution to a puzzle, but you won't get that joy of finally solving it until you've done a very slow and deliberate series of platforms to work your way back to a certain point, and that can feel unrewarding for some players. The game often fights with this balance, and more often than not I feel it does win, but I can see that slowness and the tank style movements be putting a lot of modern gamers off. But I do want to give it a shout out to its underwater controls, which still feel great, and I love the caustic effects, the water caustics I think they're called, with that feeling that you're underwater, when in effect all it's actually doing, it's just a colour shift and a transparent texture on top of the water, but you get that real sense of immersion thanks to the excellent animation and control underwater. I do want to heap some praise on the level design at this point too, as in my opinion this is the best part of the game. Take the first area of the game in Peru. Now you've got Croft Manor as a tutorial area to get you used to controls and movement, and it's absolutely superb for that. But I think the opening 3 or 4 levels teach you far more. They teach you about what to expect, what you'll be facing, how the level structures are going to work, how the save system works, and some of the pain that you'll face. If they often will, whereas later on in the game you will face instant death consequences for failure. These first levels, most of the consequences are just a bit of a time waste as you loop back around to where you were, so it teaches you the traps to look out for. If you take for example the first level, it's a fairly linear experience. You're largely going in a straight line with some climbing and light puzzles. Then in the second level it changes to be more focused central hub that sees you take one path that loops back round to that hub with a new key, or you've activated a switch that means you can take another path, much like a lot of Metroidvanias. And this second level also teaches you some of the stunts in the game. You'll pull a switch and it'll drop you into water, or there'll be some blocks that let you fall into water, and again, like I said, it doesn't kill you but it costs you time, whereas later on in the game this will outright kill you without doubt, and the game pulls that quite a lot. So it gives you an idea of what to look out for in future once that safety net has been taken away from you, much like a lot of the classic games like Mega Man did. And then there's the save system. I think the third level taught me the most about this, or perhaps it was the fourth. If you're playing on PC you can save at absolutely any time, but on consoles there's single-use save crystals scattered throughout the map. And the fact that they're single-use is really important, mainly because the game has a hub and spoke design to a lot of areas, and you can cause yourself a lot of headache and pain by using a save crystal too early, meaning you've got a lot longer period of time before you get to the next one. And this is enforced by that fourth level. Take for example, there's a room where there's a crystal sat with 3 offshoots from it, and each of those has a puzzle. Now it's fine, you can use that crystal there and then, but that means you've then to solve all 3 puzzles to unlock a door, and you don't know whether there's another crystal on the other side of that door. So do you use the crystal now before the puzzles and save your progress to this point? Do you do all 3 puzzles and then save? Do you do 1 or maybe 2 and split the difference? And it's that question that I found myself asking most of the time with save crystals. You've got that kind of initial relief, oh thank God there's a save point, I've just done a long climb, I don't want to have to do that again if I fall. But then you temper that with, hang on, I'll just have a quick look round and check maybe the next room before I use it to see what I'm letting myself in for, see if I'm maybe coming back on myself here, and I want to save this by just maybe doing an extra minute or so's gameplay. And this adds what I felt was a really enjoyable risk factor to the save mechanics, and it's why I always like to play these games on original hardware rather than emulated. When you've got access to save states, it completely negates this factor, and I would have missed out on this aspect of the game completely. Of course, the double-edged sword here, however, is there's times when it can be so frustrating when you get this balance wrong, and there's long periods of times between saves and you keep dying and you've got to do a long trek back again, especially towards the end of the game where it's got a few, to be honest, dick moves where it will just kill you unless you knew exactly what was coming. And this is going to infuriate quite a lot of modern gamers, and to be honest, quite a few older gamers as well, and I think a few will give up in frustration thanks to this save mechanic. Going back to the level design, I also want to talk about what many will say is a very, very subjective part of the game, and that's the feeling it gives. For me, this is the only Tomb Raider where I felt it lived up to the name. I was exploring tombs. There's no skyboxes here. Even when the developer wanted to do it in the Lost Valley, it's still just black, so you still feel like you're underground. In fact, many of the larger areas play up to this, with rooms sized just so they're just beyond the PS1 draw distance, leaving large areas of blackness on screen, which all add to that idea that you're in some sort of cavernous underground tomb that you're exploring. And I love this use of a technical limitation. It meant these spaces felt much larger than they were, while still adding to that feeling. And it was one of the first games to really explore sort of vertical space in 3D worlds too, with quite a few levels consisting of traversing up or down vertical spires or towers. And again, that sense that you couldn't see the bottom just added to the idea that these were huge drops. I'm sure we've all got frustrated at some point on Tomb Raider and just jumped Lara off them just to watch her fall to the bottom. Hell, even the lack of a map adds to this feeling as well, as you feel like you're the first person to explore these locations. There is no map, you've only got your wits, and you have to find the path the hard way. Which kind of brings me to another technical limitation, and it's the textures. Again, this is a double-edged sword, and for me I think it's fine, but it probably swings to the negative for most people. It's an early 3D game, so a lot of the textures are quite bad, and this can make it hard to spot things or make out jump points or handholds when you're trying to climb, things like that. And if this was, say, Uncharted or even the Anniversary reboot, then every single handhold or platform would be highlighted in modern games. You'd see those on the graphics, which is fine, don't get me wrong, I like those games, but it can sometimes feel like you're being led down a path and you're not exploring an area. I didn't get that in the original Tomb Raider. I'd often stand at the base of a wall and think, right, how do I scale this, and use the camera button to pan up and look for how I was going to traverse this space. And sometimes you'd go the wrong way and you'd have to track back, but it added to that sense that I was exploring it, I was finding the path through the game, I wasn't being led down the path through the game. And as a result of that, I felt much more immersed in the world, despite the obviously far worse visuals than an Uncharted game would offer. But I get that's very subjective, and many would find that the newer tactics of showing you the handholds and better graphics actually immerses them more than the poorer visuals that you get on display here. And speaking of that Anniversary remake that I just mentioned, I kind of want to point out how Lara and games have changed over the years. In the original opening, Lara's asked a question, what does a man need to do to get that kind of attention from you? And in the original, she replies with this line.
Attention from you.
It's hard to say exactly, but you seem to be doing fine.
Well, great.
Which is playful, light-hearted, and it fits with the tone of the game at that point. In the remake, it's changed to this line.
Now what's a man gotta do to get that sort of attention from you?
If that's the sort of attention you want, Larson, you're well on your way.
Which sounds the same, but it's cast in a much more negative light, given that the attention that they're referring to is actually her standing over a dead Bigfoot. And this for me is a change for the worse in the series. It started off on the second and third ones, and Lara became less and less likeable and believable as a human being as it went on, as she just started spouting cliches and edgy lines. And in the new reboot, she seems to be even more whiny and complaining about having emotional impacts on the people she's killed, and then the game asking you to kill dozens and dozens more with no seeming effect to it. And to be honest, I think I prefer the old Lara before they brought in all the subplots with her father, and she lost her own agency in her stories as she went from doing these things out of a sense of adventure and love for it, and more out of a sense of obligation. So for me, this was peak Lara and also peak Tomb Raider. I don't think the series ever recaptured the magic of this first one. And I said there was two things that the Anniversary showed, and one as well is the move to cinematic games. So Tomb Raider arrived at a time when games were trying to be more cinematic. Metal Gear hadn't arrived yet, so it was still a fairly fresh concept, and many games were doing it differently. And Tomb Raider had the over-the-top CG clips that many games had, but it also experimented with gameplay tweaks, changing of cameras and things like that. The most well-known of these is the T-Rex battle, and I think this is a great example to show how good it was, and how in some cases we've taken a step back. So I'd recommend playing the Anniversary version to see how this has changed over the time. In the original, the camera pulls back slightly and the screen starts to shake as you hear it, and then the camera focuses it on as it turns around the corner. And many players at this point will just panic and run. It's a wonderful set piece, and it still allows you as the player full agency. You can still move while that camera's on, you can run forward and take it on, or you can start to run. If you compare that with the remake, where a lot of that agency is taken away from you. It's very cinematic. You get a cutscene of the introduction, you get some quick time events, and then you get a fairly rubbish boss fight. And to be honest, I know which I prefer and which I feel is a step backwards for video games. So let's wrap this up then. In summary, yes, I think the game still holds up well. It's especially when you compare it to some of its peers at the time. I actually think the first is probably my favourite in the series, even over the new reboots, but to be fair, the new reboots are an entirely different genre of game at this point. But it will require a lot of patience to go back to. The slower, more methodical gameplay, the save system, it all requires a bigger investment of time from the player to really enjoy and get the most out of. And you have to get past the visual limitations of this period of time, which to be honest don't look the best. But if you take them away and remake them as Anniversary did, you kind of lose some of that atmosphere the original had, that dank tomb nature you get from those black, low draw distances. And the game's final act as well does lay it down somewhat. You have the absolute excellent High of Egypt with some great spectacles, some excellent puzzles, one of which that actually covers 2 levels, which for me is peak Tomb Raider, only then to enter the mines and puzzles that basically involve you running back and forth pressing switches that seem to be designed just to waste your time and pad the level more than anything else. And the final 2 levels devolve into little more than just sequences of death traps with a battle, death trap battle. And it would have been nice to have said the last level involved solving a puzzle or something to save the day, rather than the more action-oriented side of the game, which it doesn't do the best at. It just feels a bit rushed and perhaps lacking ideas, but that could be due to the contracted development towards the end of the game. I still think the other 12 levels more than make up for this, and I had a great time revisiting this classic. But what do you guys think? I'd love to hear your thoughts from back in the day on Tomb Raider. Have you visited recently? Does it still hold up for you? Please let me know in the comments below. And as always, I've been Retro48K, and I'll see you next time.